So we're members of the finance committee here at Dow, so we're the people along with these two here. So I'm Patrick.
I'm Rose.
Becca. Aaron.
So us four, along with two 1Ls who have yet to be appointed, form the finance committee, along with the members of the actual finance group and Professor Shapiro.
Can you see if I can hear you in the back?
Yeah, can everyone at the back hear me? Yes? Good? Okay. So today's topic, we're going to go over the basics of applying for bursaries and scholarships at Dalhousie Law School for the 2017 and 2018 year. And we're going to start off really basic with Rose just walking you through where you can actually go to find all this information that we're talking about today in case you want to look it up on another day.
Yeah, so this is the section on the Dal Law website that you can access all information about scholarships and bursaries. And the online application form will also be linked there, so that's where you'll access that. So you just go to Schulich School of Law, Dal Current Students, JD Students, and then Money Matters. The link is also there as well, and you'll post the slides after. Yeah. That's just a screenshot of the website that you'll know you've made it to the right place. So how many people here are first years? Okay. So who's second year? Oh, okay. So for this first part for the Schulich scholarships, it's only for second and third years. If you got a Schulich scholarship in first year, you'll have already been awarded it. So that's the amount, and it's awarded in December, but you still apply in the whole scholarship cycle. And so you can apply for two of the three criteria there. So you can either apply for two of academic merit, financial need, or community service. If you choose to apply to all three, we as a committee will choose your best two categories to take into consideration. So for academic merit, you don't really have to do much because we already have access to your transcript. But on the online application form, you can fill in any additional information that you might find relevant or want us to know about it. And then for financial need, that's strictly done on the online application form as well. So then the part that's not done on the online application form is the community service record. And for that, you complete it as a separate document and then hand it in to reception at room 122.
So the community service record is broken down into three headings, and this is how you should format your community service record when you submit it. So their three headings are school activities, community life, and entrepreneurial talent. Those are pretty self-explanatory, but we're going to go a little bit more in depth into what might constitute each of those categories. So your school activities are going to be, the extracurricular activities, the responsibilities that you take on whether you're at Dow Law or for people who are doing programs, that can also include the other programs that you're in. And in this section, you're going to want to describe, what that activity is. So for instance, what group it's with, what your title is, what kind of activities you actually perform for the group, what your commitment is in terms of time, how long you've actually been committed to the group. So have you been doing this, only for the past few months, or have you been doing this for the past few years? Same thing for community life. So this is going to be your contributions to the greater community, whether that's the greater Dow community or Halifax or your local communities back from wherever you come from. And you're going to want to cover the same stuff. So you want to give us as much detail as possible in terms of what your commitments look like, what you've actually contributed to these groups, to the community, to your school, while also being brief enough that we can go through hundreds of these and see really easily, compare you really easily to other students. So we would recommend, for instance, formatting these categories into a bullet point. Maybe one bullet lists, for instance, how long you've been working for the group. Maybe the second bullet lists what you do for the group and your title and whatnot. And the third category is one that trips up people a little bit sometimes. It's called entrepreneurial talent. For us, we generally view entrepreneurial talent as someone who's, for instance, started their own company or started their own non-for-profit, or maybe you've started a large, successful initiative within an existing organization, but something that really demonstrates that you've gone out on your own and started something from scratch. a lot of people for entrepreneurial talent, they'll often put in a leadership role in a group where they've kind of entered that leadership role, but it's already an existing organization or an existing initiative. We don't rate that as highly as something where you've gone out and created it yourself. It might count a little bit, particularly, for instance, if you've stepped into a leadership role and maybe you have introduced some large initiative or kind of overhauled the role itself. That might contribute to entrepreneurial talent. The key, again, is going to be describing how that meets what we view as entrepreneurial talent. So being sufficient, giving us enough detail in that description in the community service record. And so you're going to want to carefully follow the instructions that are given on the online application form for the community service record and provide the required information like the kind I just discussed with you for each activity. And again, this gets printed and delivered to the reception office in room 122.
Yeah, so just to reiterate, this portion of the presentation only applies to second and third year students. And you choose 2 of those 3 categories. The first 2 are completed on the online application form, then the community service is physically handed in. But the online application form will give you detailed instructions for completing the community service record.
So after the Schulich Scholarships, what we're going to be discussing from now on applies to all years because 1Ls can apply for named awards and general bursaries. So there are 3 essentially different kinds of named awards. There are ones that have no financial need and specific criteria that have been set up by whoever the benefactor is, for instance, of the award. There are those with financial need and specific criteria. And then there are general bursaries which don't have any specific criteria attached to them. It's on a financial need basis only. For all 3, you need to use the online application to apply for them. For the latter 2, so where there's a financial need and specific criteria, or for general bursaries, so essentially where there is financial need, you'll need to do the financial section of the online application and provide supporting financial documents to back up what you're saying in that online application, which we'll go into later. And for the first 2, so where there are specific criteria, for instance, whether you're from a specific geographic region or whether you have a particular interest in a subject area of law, you will need to submit what are called statements of eligibility, where you actually discuss in detail and provide examples of how you meet those specific criteria so that you can be eligible for the awards. So the important thing with the named awards is, first and foremost, there is a really good booklet put out by the people who work in finance here that details all of the named awards and the whole application process. So we highly recommend that you look at those and that you actually read the criteria for the named awards before deciding to apply and before writing your statements of eligibility. Each year there's people who just kind of spam applications to every single award, and they don't really care whether they meet the criteria. They might not be from the province that you need to be for the award, or they might not have an interest in the particular area of law that the award requires. But just make sure that you read them and that you then tailor your statements of eligibility to describe how you meet those criteria. And that's particularly important for a couple of reasons. In the past, we've not awarded named awards or bursaries to people to anyone in a given year because we didn't have anyone who met the criteria, or who at least in their application said that they met the criteria or explained how they met it. It's also really important because if we're comparing you against other students who have maybe done a better job of explaining how they meet the criteria, then you're going to be at a disadvantage and you might not get the award. And when you're going to actually write these statements of eligibility, it's important that you do one for each award. So it isn't a single statement of eligibility that you submit for all of them. It's a single statement of eligibility for each award. Normally you'd have, for instance, the award's name at the top, and then you would tailor that statement of eligibility to the criteria for the particular award. And when you're going through this, please use point form. We have, I don't know how many actual awards, probably over 100, and we get many applications for them, and we'll be reading through them all. But if you do it in point form, it helps us pick out the important information really quickly. You want to be minimalistic in that we don't want long, kind of rambling paragraphs describing maybe, for instance, how you meet the criteria or what you do with particular organizations. But point form, again, something like you would use for the Schulich Scholarship in the same kind of vein. That's what's really going to give us the best ability to pick out the important information quick while not having it lost in a bunch, in a long kind of rambling answer. Make sure when you're doing the actual statements of eligibility that you do not self-identify. when we're going through the awards, the only thing that we have is your B00 number, so that we can remain impartial and we don't know who we're giving the awards to. We don't want you to self-identify anywhere on the statement of eligibility, so please make sure that you don't do that. I know in the past some people have asked questions about, well, what if, I'm in a position that everyone knows I'm in that position and I'm going to self-identify by, for instance, listing that I'm the president of a certain society. That's fine. You can't really get around that. People sometimes will be able to tell who the person is based on what their criteria, based on what they say that they've done. In those situations, sometimes the person will exclude themselves from making the decision if they know who it is when it comes to actually giving the awards. But to avoid that, we also never do the named awards for our own year. So for instance, as a third year, I would never give out awards I'm not the person who goes through and ranks the people for the third year awards, and it's to avoid being too familiar with what people do and who they are, and so that we don't identify them. And so once you're done these statements of eligibility, one for each award that you end up applying for, you print them all out, and again, you deliver them to the reception office in room 122. And we ask that when you do, that you use paper clips only and that you don't staple them. And the reason for this is that they have to be taken apart and they all get put into separate kind of manila folders. And if they're stapled together, it just makes a lot more work for us. So this is an example of what you can find in the actual scholarship booklet. And this is, for instance, so on the far left right there, you have the title of the award. On the right next to it, it describes the award. Essentially, it often will give you maybe a little bit of history of where it came from, what kind of characteristics they're looking for in the person they're going to give it to. The one to the right of that is the amount of the award, and then in bullet points to the right of that that's the nitty-gritty in terms of the criteria that you have to meet. So if you look at the second one there, Cape Breton Barrister Society, you can see that to be eligible for that award, you have to be from Cape Breton County, you have to have financial need, and you have to have demonstrated good academic performance. There's a bunch of different language in terms of what academic performance. So that one says good academic performance, whereas you see the top one says superior academic record. We have an internal metric that we use essentially for what that means in terms of grade cutoffs. But if you just apply and you think that you have academic performance, we can sort that out later. I don't know if we want to send that separately, or maybe include that in this before we post it.
I think it's good if students think they need it academically.
Then they just
go
apply.
ahead and apply, and then
Yeah.
we'll know if we're going
Okay.
through if they
Yeah.
follow that.
It's really easy for us to very quickly see who meets the criteria or not. But if you think that you meet it based on that, apply. But for something that has, for instance, a geographical requirement like Cape Breton County, you're going to want to, in your statement of eligibility, make it explicit that you meet that criteria. We don't require, for instance, a birth certificate showing that you were born in Cape Breton County, or a driver's license showing that you live there, because a lot of people won't have that. They'll have, their current address, for instance, if they live here in Halifax. But just mentioning somewhere, maybe showing that you have a connection. So maybe you would write that you were born in Cape Breton County and you went to school there until you were 10 or whatnot. Just showing us somehow that you meet the criteria, because in a lot of years, again, there are people who apply for these and then don't mention that they're from Cape Breton County. And even though they may be, we can't tell from their application, and no one gets the award or they don't get the award. So we have this category, mature students. So there are some criteria where there's a preference for, or you're required to be a mature student in order to get a named award. DAL has taken a very holistic approach to what constitutes a mature student. In the past, it was strictly age-based, but now it takes into a number of characteristics, including age, but also personal circumstances, in particular family status. So for instance, whether you have children. For age, I would note, because we ran into this issue last year, when you apply to law school, mature students are those who are 26 years old before September 1st of their first year. Just because you're 26 years old while you're in law school does not make you a mature student. So for instance, if you're in second or third year and you're 26 years old, that means that you were not a mature student when you started school, and so you're not a mature student by virtue of age for the purposes of applying for awards. Most people, when they graduate from law school, will probably be about 26 years old, unless you came straight from your undergrad. So that's not what it means in terms of mature students for the purposes of awards. So financial need is another one of the common criteria for the awards. Simply applying for for financial need does not require any statements of eligibility attached to it. So if the award is strictly, or the bursary is strictly on financial need basis, you don't need to attach any kind of a statement of eligibility other than the supporting financial documentation that backs up what you're going to put into the online application. And in applying on a financial need basis, the school assumes that you've exhausted all financial resources at your disposal. So this includes student loans and lines of credit from your banks or your financial institutions. But if you've been denied either of these, so for instance, if you've applied for a student loan and the government has denied it because maybe you made too much money, you need to provide documentation stating that you were denied and evidence that you did apply and that you were denied that loan. So in terms of supporting documentation for debt instruments, so this would be your student loans, your lines of credit with your bank, or your private loans, you need to provide supporting documentation for each debt instrument, so for each line of credit you have or each loan, indicating the amount that was owing as of August 31st, 2017. But the amount owing August 31st, 2017 will not include the amount of tuition that you've paid before August 31st. So what that means is that we need to know how much you had in terms of a student line of credit as of August 31st, minus any amount that you might have paid for tuition this year. So do not include any tuition that you might have paid already for DAL for this year. It's only the amount that you had owing before that. Again, this has to be provided for personal loans, credit cards, personal lines of credit, etc. If you don't have a personal loan or a line of credit, again, you'll need to show supporting documentation for why you don't have one. For instance, you were denied one when you applied. For student loans, so you again need to provide documentation. For Canada and provincial student loans, this is your loan assessment form is what you get from most provinces, and this will show the amount that you've been awarded and also your allowable costs and expenses, which you probably had to give the government when you were awarded this loan. And you must provide the assessment form where possible. So in the past, students, for instance, have given printouts or screenshots, for instance, of maybe their student loan page online. That's not acceptable, particularly where there's an assessment form available. I'm not 100% familiar with all the provinces. I think most of them provide some sort of an assessment form that you can actually download or print off. If there are any issues with that, you can always ask us questions, but where an assessment form is available, that is what we're asking for. And again, if you didn't apply for one of these loans, you need to show some sort of an explanation and documentation for why you did not or why you were ultimately refused one. And that is going to be taken into account. Now, if you were refused a loan, you can still provide us with the allowable costs and expenses that you've submitted to the government, and we'll look at that and take that into consideration when looking at issues such as financial need. If loan information is not available by the application deadline, you can still apply. But you will need to submit, for instance, your assessment form at a later date. Please be aware that we will not follow up with anyone for their assessment forms. So if you do submit without submitting your assessment form, it's on you to then follow up and give it to us. No one's going to be chasing you down for that to complete your application. And if we don't receive it, then your application will be considered incomplete. And again, just to know, we do require supporting documentation for all of this. So your student loans, your personal line of credit, your credit cards, showing how much you were in debt, or if you don't have those, why you were denied and that you did apply. Also taking into account for financial need is childcare costs. If you have any, again, we require proof of what those expenses are for childcare costs, and healthcare costs in excess of $500, again, required supporting documentation in order to be considered.
Can I just make one note? For any of you that are curious, any of your financial documentation is only seen by myself or by Donna Beaver. She's our Director of Finance, and I take care of all the financials for the committee. So we are the only ones who see all that confidential financial information. The student committee members don't see that. They just receive a ranking from us as to how you rank financial needs. They'll get a number, but they won't see your documentation. Okay?
So this is what the financial needs section looks like when you go through the online application. So for instance, at the top there, it's asking, if you've been approved for a private loan, how much you've been approved for, how much you've actually used on and owe. Same thing below for the personal lines of credit. So this is where you're going to want to find out what, for instance, you were owing on August 31st, 2017, and that's what you're going to put in there. So in summary, for all of these, you're going to want to complete the online application form. So that includes Schulich Scholarships, all the named awards, and the general bursaries. You're going to want to hand in the hard copies of the supporting documentation and the required documentation to room 122. And just to summarize, so for Schulich, that's going to comprise your community service record and supporting financial documents where applicable. For the named awards, where there's no financial need, you're only going to have to hand in a physical copy of the statements of eligibility, one per award. For named awards where there is financial need and specific, non-specific criteria, you're going to have, again, your statements of eligibility, but also the supporting financial documentation that we just discussed. And then for general bursaries, which are awarded on a financial basis only, you're only going to need to put in your supporting financial documents. So those are also our emails. So you have Rose, myself, Aaron, and Rebecca. If you have any questions after this presentation and you don't want to talk to us now or you want to talk to us throughout the application process, please feel free to email us at these. This entire presentation is going to be posted online at the end of this session. The actual application deadline, so when you're all going to have your application in for, is Wednesday, October 11th at 3:30. So that's when you'll have to have gone online, done the online application. That's when you're going to have delivered your physical copies of your statements of eligibility, your community service records, and your supporting documentation to room 122. And it's at 3:30 p.m. There's no extensions given on this, and please don't underestimate how long it sometimes takes to actually do these, particularly doing statements of eligibility. If you're tailoring them like you should be for each of the individual awards, it's going to mean that you're going to have to make essentially a new one, not necessarily a new one from scratch, but you're going to have to do a lot of editing for each one, and it can sometimes take 3-4 hours plus to actually do that. Some people also run into problems getting their loan assessment forms, so make sure that you give yourself ample time to get that done and to submit them on time.
When you're filling out the application, you can only do it once, so make sure you have everything with you when you sit down to fill out an online application, because you can't make changes after you submitted it. And you can't save it and then come back to it later. It has to be all done at one time. In the past couple of years, also, the last day, everybody's in the library trying to print your statements of eligibility. People run out of time. They don't get their applications in time because there's a lineup at the printer. So don't wait till the last day to get your stuff together. Try to get it done a little bit earlier, because there will be a lineup at the printers in the library, and then I have people running to my office. I can't get my stuff printed, it's going to be late. But you guys have weeks and weeks to get it taken care of, so don't wait until the last minute.
Are there any questions?
Is the eligibility affected by part-time or full-time status?
Didn't hear that.
Is eligibility affected by part-time or full-time status?
No, we just modified for if you're part-time, we modified by prorating it.
Where do you get the info booklet that you were talking about?
Yeah, so
It's all linked on the website.
Thank you.
There's frequently asked questions, link on the website. Read that. Before you ask any questions, make sure you read that, because everything in there is answered. On the day you're getting your application, if you can't ask the receptionist, she won't have any